Hello, my friends. I'm Dave. Thank you for tuning in as always. I just realized I spent an hour recording this video only to find out that the microphone wasn't working, so now we're doing it all over again. Anyway, hopefully second time's the charm here. Today we are talking about private space companies and would I or wouldn't I consider investing in them if they went public. So I have three that I would invest in at the right valuation and three that I would definitely want to stay away from. I think this is a great way to highlight some of the cool stuff that is happening on the private side of the space industry, because on this channel we focus so much on publicly traded companies we can currently invest in. And there's a lot of cool stuff going on the private side that, will probably eventually come public one day. So it's interesting to keep up with that stuff. Please do consider subscribing if you are new here. Every new subscriber helps out so much. And with that out of the way, let's dive into some private space companies. So, starting off with the companies that I would invest in, of course, it all comes down to valuation and at the right price, but I certainly would consider making an investment. Number one, of course, is SpaceX. Now, SpaceX should need no introduction. They've been dominating the space industry for the past decade. Their valuation has ballooned from $74 billion in 2021 to $400 billion by mid 2025. So, early investors have certainly done extremely well. They now own the majority of satellites in orbit around the Earth via their Starlink constellation. And Starlink is really becoming a cash flow machine at this point with their broadband internet connectivity to areas that don't have great service via traditional means. They're also now working on a direct to cell constellation to provide internet connectivity directly to everyday smartphones, and that market is going to be absolutely massive. Starlink fighting it out with AST Space Mobile on that one. They purchased a bunch of spectrum from SATS, and they will now, in a couple years, with some new chips going into phones, be able to provide high bandwidth connectivity direct to phones. The total addressable market here, absolutely massive. Obviously, they have the most reliable rocket in the game with their Falcon 9, really mastered reusing that first stage, massively bringing down costs and ramping up the scale to something we've never seen before. Starship is planning to radically change the game even further by reusing the second stage as well, making the entire rocket fully reusable and bringing an unprecedented amount of payload into low Earth orbit. They're also chasing after orbital refueling, which will allow them to take that unprecedented payload and bring it to the moon, Mars, or potentially even beyond in the future, and really just could be a game-changing rocket for the future of humanity. However, this was a little bit more of a difficult decision for me than you may have thought. And there are some reasons why I'm a little bit worried, a little bit skeptical of SpaceX as an investment. First of all, the potential of the company and the plans of the company to dump tons and tons of capital into a Mars colony. While I do think that is cool as a human, and I would absolutely love to see humans working and living on Mars in the future, expanding the reach of humanity beyond low Earth orbit, I don't really see the business case for it at this point, and I think it would be a massive cash burn for SpaceX for basically the foreseeable future. And, while I'm happy to see it as a human, as an investor, you do want return on invested capital, and to see so much capital just going into something where I don't see the return, that is a tough pill to swallow for me. I've also soured a bit lately on Elon Musk, CEO, obviously, of SpaceX. I did very well investing in his Tesla from a fairly early point, and obviously he's done very well for his investors in SpaceX up to this point. But just kind of get tired of having to deal with the fact that he might at any point send out a tweet that tanks the stock by 20% plus on a given day. He might say something silly. He's become quite a lightning rod. He's gotten himself involved in politics. And when you're a company whose biggest customer for your rocket is the government saying something, you know, political is not always advisable and has really come back to bite them. Of course, he has the right to do that as a citizen, and we as investors would have the right not to invest in his companies if he is going to say stuff like that. One of the reasons why I love investing in Rocket Lab, I certainly can't imagine Peter Beck saying something like, well, whatever the heck Elon says on a given day that might tank his stocks. There's also still a lot to prove for Starship at this point. They've got to get orbital refueling down. They've got to get the heat shield down. They haven't actually had a full orbital successful launch as of this point, not that they've even tried. So, it's hard to knock them on that one. But I think it's fair to say Starship development has gone slower than a lot of us had hoped and maybe even anticipated. Good progress made on the last test flight, but there still is a lot of work to be done on Starship, and no doubt they are burning an incredible amount of capital on that program. So for those reasons, it's a little touch and go with SpaceX, but I think the attractiveness of the Starlink cash flow and, the interesting potential of Starship would mean that I would still be open to investing in the company despite some of those potential negatives that I did mention. You know, as I look at all the cool things that these companies are building towards in the future of the space industry, it strikes me that future isn't this unknowable, mysterious thing coming towards us out of our control. It's actually being built right now in humanity's smartest minds, solving the puzzles we really need to figure out. The question is, how do you get a mind like that? How do you move past memorizing formulas and truly start understanding the kind of complex, high-stakes science that helps build the future? Well, that brings us to today's sponsor, Brilliant.org. Brilliant is the interactive, hands-on way to master the quantitative skills that matter. It's not about passively watching lectures, it's about training your brain with bite-sized, challenging problems in math, logic, and computer science that force you to think from first principles. Brilliant's platform uses visualization and interactive challenges to make sure concepts like gravitational fields and orbital mechanics truly click. With courses on math, science, programming, data, AI, and more, it's the practice you need to build the foundational STEM knowledge that fuels innovation at every company pushing the limits of our reach. So stop watching and start doing. To learn for free on Brilliant, go to brilliant.org/DaveGInvesting, scan the QR code on screen, or click the link in the description down below. Brilliant has given our viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited access to everything on Brilliant. That's brilliant.org/DaveGInvesting. Train your mind, change your orbit. And now, back to the video. Now, number 2 is Stoke Space, another company you've probably heard me talk about before if you are a longtime viewer of the channel. They have quite an interesting idea to tackle complete reusability on their rocket, doing it differently than SpaceX or anyone else, frankly, who is chasing 100% reusability at this point. Of course, they don't have an operational rocket yet, but we have seen pretty tangible progress from the company, including tests of their second stage with hops and things of that nature, which will be using a regenerative cooling as opposed to the tile approach that SpaceX with their Starship is taking. This is a much smaller rocket than Starship. It's going to be bringing something like 3 to 5 tons to low Earth orbit in fully reusable mode versus Starship 100 tons. So they're not going head to head really with Starship, and even significantly smaller than, say, Rocket Lab's Neutron. But the potential of complete reuse is nonetheless pretty tantalizing. In terms of their first stage engines, they're going with a full flow stage combustion design, which is a complicated and challenging engine to build, but it does have a very high ceiling in terms of efficiency and long life and performance. This is the same type of engine as SpaceX's Raptor. It's extremely impressive that they've had so much success already with such a small team. We've already seen test firings of Stoke's first stage engine, and they've made great progress on that front. CEO Andy Lapsa also seems to be pretty much the real deal. He seems very impressive on all the interviews I've seen him speaking, very technically knowledgeable, which is something I look for in an investment as opposed to a CEO who is more of a businessman than a technical kind of guy. For whatever reason, that just doesn't seem to work out as well with space companies, I find. And the company has also been on-ramped onto the government's NSSL program for national security space launch, which is potentially lucrative source of government contracts, although it will still be a few years before they get any launches off under that program. It is a good show of confidence in the company. Once again, there's no company that is all positives and no negatives, though. So for Stoke, there's no revenue yet. It's a very early stage, which makes sense given that it's still private, and hopefully they wait until they have some revenue before going public. The focus seems to be only on rockets and space mobility, though, which does give me a bit of pause. I don't find rockets on their own to be a great business model. I think it is great when it's combined with the satellites and you can optimize both sides of the equation, get that recurring revenue stream of satellites and payloads in orbit. But when you're just a rocket launcher, I think it's a tough business to be successful in. The total addressable market is not really that high right now. And of course, you're competing with SpaceX and others. So I would like Stoke to be able to expand beyond just launch in order for me to invest in them. But, their concept, the execution we've seen so far, and the CEO means that I might be willing to take a flyer on them with a relatively small investment if they don't have the satellite piece. Of course, there's also risk when it comes to rocket programs. And even though we've seen a considerable amount of hardware from Stoke when it comes to engines, second stage hops, second stage test firings, and even some tanks for the first stage, there's still an unproven company that has not launched to orbit yet. So definitely a lot of risk that still needs to be retired there with the company. Third up on space companies that I would be interested in investing in is Impulse Space. Now, Impulse was founded by SpaceX's #1 employee, Tom Mueller. This guy has an outstanding resume. He led the development of the workhorse Merlin engine for SpaceX's Falcon rocket, or even Falcon 1, frankly. Draco thrusters as well for the Dragon capsule, both crew and cargo variants. If you believe in prioritizing investment into outstanding people, well, Tom would probably be a very good guy to bet on. So Impulse's whole concept really involves space mobility. They're not going to work on launch on the ground, but they're going to get you from low Earth orbit to other locations. Their first space tug is called the Mira. It's been designed to take payloads dropped off in lower Earth orbits and then move them to higher orbits. The idea being that this will complement Starship when it comes online and has a massive capacity to just dump tons of satellites into low Earth orbit. The Mira can then get those satellites to where they need to go. Starship being the train or bus, and Mira being like the Uber from the train station, if you will. Mira did have, from what I understand, one successful test flight so far. I would say the downside to this, though, is that, it's great that they're not competing with SpaceX, but that also means that they're kind of reliant on SpaceX to execute on time and to execute with their Starship, as without a ride already to orbit, the Mira is pretty much not useful, of course. So Helios is their next space vehicle. It's a high-energy kick stage designed to take larger payloads from low Earth orbit into higher orbits, as well as even lunar transfer or interplanetary trajectories. Their first mission for Helios is planned for 2026. They've also recently announced plans to develop their own lunar lander to deliver medium-sized payloads to the moon with no in-space refueling required, which is a great perk, given that is one of the issues we're a little bit worried about when it comes to SpaceX's Starship lunar lander. Helios will act as cruise stage for this lunar vehicle, taking it from low Earth orbit to lunar orbit with a target capacity about 3 tons, which should slide in nicely between the small landers like Firefly's Blue Ghost or Intuitive Machines' Nova, like Blue Origin's and SpaceX's lunar landers for the Artemis program. They think that there's a nice gap in there that their lunar lander will be able to fill. Now, I will say the bad for Impulse to me is that the space tug market does seem pretty unproven. The market for it right now is kind of unknown. They're a bit reliable on Starship being a success and just dumping tons of satellites into LEO for their space mobility to be successful. The TAM for Helios and their lunar lander seems a little bit uncertain to me. Satellite constellations have a lot more certainty and probably a lot bigger of a market. The biggest market in space right now is pretty much undoubtedly low Earth orbit communications, which is not their focus. So, they are kind of on the fringes when you think about that. Revenue doesn't appear to be very much so far. Now, they have won several contract awards, but some of them have, ceiling values or indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts, which means we don't actually know how much they'll end up being awarded on those umbrella contracts. Still a long way to go, and I assume they are very much in high cash burn mode at this point. Nevertheless, given the track record of Tom and some of the interesting developments we've seen on Impulse, at the right valuation, I might be willing to take a flyer on this one as well, were they to go public. Now we come to 3 that I would say no thanks to if they did go public. Number 1, a company I'm sure you all are very familiar with is Blue Origin. Blue is quite an interesting company. Now, on the one hand, they appear to have pretty much limitless capital thanks to Jeff Bezos and his Amazon bucks. And New Glenn is actually quite an exciting rocket. If Starship wasn't coming online at the same time, taking a lot of the limelight, there would be a ton of excitement around New Glenn. They've already had a first launch, which was successful, although still some work to do on the landing and reuse portion of that first stage. They're not currently working towards reuse of their second stage, as far as I'm aware. There was some research on that, and maybe they'll circle back to it at some point. But right now, the focus firmly is on reuse of just the first stage alone. So from that point of view, completing with a fully reusable Starship might be a little bit challenging in the long term. While SpaceX has the reputation of being kind of the place to go work if you're ready to work extremely hard, long hours, and sacrifice your personal life for the mission of getting humans multiplanetary, Blue Origin kind of has the reputation of being where you should go if you want to have a good work-life balance, which of course is nice for employees who have families, but not necessarily a good sign for a efficient use of capital for investors. And they certainly don't have the track record of working extremely quickly either. Took quite a while for New Glenn to come to fruition, and New Shepard as well. I highly doubt they're making money on that suborbital capsule, despite it being kind of a cool product. They do have a lunar lander under development for the Artemis program called Blue Moon, which is pretty exciting. And if they do ever deliver humans down to the surface of the moon, I will give them a massive props for such a huge accomplishment. But it's also a pretty limited product to a single customer, being NASA, and the market for it is therefore not that huge, which wouldn't make it a product that I would want to build an entire investment thesis around. And as I said previously, over the past few years in space, we've all kind of come to the understanding that the largest market is for satellite constellations. And although those constellations do require launch to get into orbit, the greatest value, in my opinion, is bringing both sides of that equation together. Clearly, SpaceX has demonstrated that you can be very successful with their Starlink and Falcon 9 rockets. Rocket Lab chasing similar hopes. Blue Origin, though, not so much. Now, they are going to be launching a next gen internet constellation called Kuiper that's going to go head to head with Starlink for broadband internet connectivity. But that constellation will end up being owned by Amazon and not Blue Origin. So, for Blue Origin, investors, really the only benefit they're getting is the value of those launch contracts. And they're not even going to be the only ones launching Kuiper. There's also been contracts given out to ULA, Ariane Space, even some SpaceX contracts as well. So in order for Blue Origin to make an attractive investment to me, I'd kind of rather see them having Kuiper under their own umbrella. Unfortunately, it's just so expensive that I think they really had to do it under Amazon as opposed to under Blue Origin. They do have some space mobility vehicles of their own, but as I said, the market for that is not really proven at this point, and obviously smaller than communications. So for those reasons, culture, total addressable market, all the rest, I would have to take a pass on Blue Origin at this point if they were to go public. All right, next up is Relativity Space. And if you've been watching this channel for a while, you probably know that I've not been a very big fan of Relativity for several years now. The plan to 100% 3D print rockets seemed like a little bit of a gimmick to me, didn't make a ton of sense. While 3D printing can make a lot of sense for smaller components, rocket engines, things like that, to 3D print the large structures just seemed, to me, frankly, like extremely odd, a bit of a waste of time, very slow, and didn't make a ton of sense. Relativity seems to have admitted the same thing because they did eventually pivot from the 3D printing of the entire rocket to using some traditional manufacturing methods for some of those larger structures, although they do still cite 3D printing as one of their competitive strengths. Now, Relativity did have one fairly successful test flight for their smaller Terran 1 rocket, but immediately following that flight, they decided to cancel that rocket and focus completely on their larger Terran R rocket. Financially, this decision is somewhat understandable because it takes a long time to scale up cadence enough with a small rocket to make it profitable. So for a cash burning company to operate a small rocket unprofitably while trying to build out a large rocket is a tall ask and a big cash burn. But the downside is they have no revenue now for several years until the Terran R becomes operational. And speaking of the Terran R, I wasn't a huge fan of the update where they originally said, oh yeah, it's going to be 100% reusable. We're going to recover the second stage. And the pivot was that they're going to be focusing on just recovering the first stage and not the second stage right now. So that will, of course, make it a little bit harder for them to compete with not only Starship and the Stoke space rocket, but also even just Falcon 9 as well. This one being a pretty direct competitor to Falcon 9 and Starship. It is a larger vehicle than, say, Rocket Lab's Neutron. Another downside for Relativity to me is just the massive amount of capital they've already raised and burned through to date, with no rocket, at least operational rocket, in sight as of yet. Just staggering amounts of capital raises, and the hype was real around this company, but they kind of ran out of capital. To top that off, they did sign several extremely large launch deals, which of course sounds good in theory to have customers lined up ready to go. But the downside of signing these launch deals so far out from having an operational rocket is that it usually means you are steeply discounting them to get that customer to sign up for a rocket, which is unproven and years away from operations. So I do think that if they do launch Terran R, they'll be operating at a loss for quite a while, trying to get out from underneath some of these extremely cheap launch contracts that they signed early on. The launch contracts were great for drumming up hype for the company and allowing them to raise more capital. But I think it will be an issue for them to get out of underneath some of these contracts if they even do end up launching them at all. When the company ran out of money, it did end up getting taken over by ex-Google CEO Eric Schmidt. It's always possible he might turn things around, as he is quite a good businessman, but he's not really an aerospace guy who's technically knowledgeable in that area or has experience in that area. From my awareness, and as I said previously, that is one of the things I do look for in a CEO of a space company. His long-term vision, beyond obviously getting the Terran R launching, is that he appears to think data centers in orbit are going to be required in order to build out the AI infrastructure that we're on the path to building out right now. The thing with data centers in orbit, I mean, there's lots of pluses and minuses to the idea. I know a lot of people who think they're not really viable. Some of the issues that they cite is that it's actually very hard to dissipate the heat that's been generated from all these GPUs when you're in orbit, and not to mention being in direct sunlight generates a lot of heat as well. It turns out vacuum doesn't actually conduct temperatures very well, so they might need to build some kind of massive radiators to try and dissipate the heat being generated by all these GPUs, and that may make it not as practical. Obviously, the data center in orbit does sidestep dealing with, on the ground permits and infrastructure build out, and the power requirements are a little bit easier because if you're in orbit, you can theoretically just capture sunlight all the time. And there's so many power constraints when you're on the ground. But I think the data center in orbit idea has yet to really been proven out. So to me, overall, relativity, if this one does go public, is just a hard avoid at this point. Okay, our third space company that I don't think I would invest in if they did go public is Sierra Space. Now, Sierra Space's flagship project is, of course, the Dream Chaser, which has had an extremely long and fraught development history. Developed from a NASA concept back in the 80s and 90s, development of the Dream Chaser originally began back in 2004 under a company called Space Dev. Now, that company was acquired by Sierra Nevada in 2008, work continuing on the concept since then. The vehicle did lose out to Dragon and Starliner in the competition from NASA to deliver commercial crew to the International Space Station, but it continued on with a contract to deliver cargo to the space station, and eventually Sierra Nevada did spin out Sierra Space into a separate company. Delays just seem to keep coming up when it comes to the Dream Chaser, though, and their contract with NASA was actually just revised this September. From originally having 7 cargo missions guaranteed to the ISS, the contract now no longer specifies a number of missions, although NASA retains the ability to order such missions. Additionally, the first flight of the Dream Chaser was originally supposed to go to the ISS, but now the first test flight is just going to be a free flight demonstration of the craft's capabilities and not actually dock with the station. Given the life of the ISS and the fact that it appears to be coming to an end as of the early 2030s, and we're already mid-2020s with no launch of Dream Chaser yet in sight, it brings into doubt whether the craft will ever actually dock with the ISS at all, which would obviously be extremely disappointing for the company. Now, they do feel that they'll be able to operate it to deliver people and cargo to commercial space stations in the future. Well, whether that could be the Blue Origin Orbital Reef Station that we haven't heard much about for some time, or potentially other stations as well. I think there's still a long way to go and a lot of cash burn for a spacecraft that's been basically in development since 2004, so over 20 years now. It's not only about the Dream Chaser for Sierra Nevada. Of course, they did also land quite a large contract from the Space Development Agency to build out a constellation of missile tracking satellites for $740 million. So I do think this is quite a good, valuable contract for the company and a step in the right direction. They did clear critical design review in November of 2024, clearing the way for manufacturing of the satellites. But I don't think this one contract is enough to outweigh the the massive cash burn and uncertainty around the Dream Tracer and lack of customers for it at this point, NASA really being the only customer until commercial space stations come online, which may still be a while. And of course, as I said previously, the ISS looking to deorbit in the early 2030s. So for those reasons, Sierra Space would, for me, as be a hard pass as well. There was some talk of them potentially going public this year, but I think with some of the issues around Dream Chaser and the delays, that's probably been put on pause for now. So those are kind of my 3, yes, I would invest at the right price, private space companies. 3, I would avoid at all costs, space companies. And 3, that there's potential here, but it's kind of a wait and see for you. Let me know what you think about any of those companies. If you disagree with me on one of them that you would invest in or wouldn't. If there's any other companies that weren't on the list that you think would make a good investment should they go public in the future. Always interested to continue the discussion down in the comments. Of course, some of these IPOs may be a long way out if they do ever materialize, but I think it's a great way to shine a spotlight on some of these other interesting projects that we don't get enough attention in the space industry from the general public. Please do subscribe if you like this video and you're not already subscribed. Every new subscriber is so much appreciated. I hope you guys have a great day and a great rest of the week. I'll see you soon for the next video. Bye for now.